it back to her. Or rather, perhaps he had handed it and she hadn't taken it. Perhaps it had slipped into the boat. He would go and see. But he did not find it in the boat, though he turned up the carpet and even took up the boards to look. And then an extremely miserable little boy began to search for an amethyst ring in all sorts of impossible places, indoors and out. You know the hopeless way in which you look for things that you know perfectly well you will never find. The borrowed penknife that you dropped in the woods, for instance, or the week's pocket money which slipped through that hole in your pocket as you went to the village to spend it. The servants gave him his meals and told him to cheer up. But cheering up and Kenneth were, for the time, strangers. People in books never can eat when they are in trouble, but I have noticed myself that if the trouble has gone on for some hours, eating is really rather a comfort. You don't enjoy eating so much as usual, perhaps, but at any rate it is something to do, and takes the edge off your sorrow for a short time. And cook was sorry for Kenneth, and sent him up a very nice dinner and a very nice tea. Roast chicken and gooseberry pie the dinner was, and for tea there was cake with almond icing on it. The sun was very low when he went back wearily to have one more look in the boat for that detestable amethyst ring. Of course it was not there, and the picnic party would be home soon, and he really did not know what his aunt would do to him. "Shut me up in a dark cupboard, perhaps," he thought gloomily, "or put me to bed all day to-morrow, or give me lines to write out, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of them." The boat, set in motion by his stepping into it, swung out to the full length of its rope. The sun was shining almost level across the water. It was a very still evening, and the reflections of the trees and of the house were as distinct as the house and the trees themselves, and the water was unusually clear. He could see the fish swimming about, and the sand and pebbles at the bottom of the moat. How clear and quiet it looked down there, and what fun the fishes seemed to be having. "I wish I was a fish," said Kenneth. "Nobody punishes them for taking rings they didn't take." And then suddenly he saw the ring itself, lying calm and quiet and round and shining on the smooth sand at the bottom of the moat. He reached for the boat hook and leaned over the edge of the boat, trying to get up the ring on the boat hook's point. Then there was a splash. "Good gracious, I wonder what that is," said cook in the kitchen, and dropped the saucepan with the Welsh rabbit in it, which she had just made for kitchen supper. Kenneth had leaned out too far over the edge of the boat had suddenly decided to go the other way, and Kenneth had fallen into the water. The first thing he felt was delicious coolness, the second that his clothes had gone, and the next thing he noticed was that he was swimming quite easily and comfortably under water, and that he had no trouble with his breathing, such as people who tell you not to fall into water seem to expect you to have. Also he could see quite well, which he had never been able to do under water before. "I can't think," he said to himself, "why people make so much fuss about your falling into the water. I shan't be in a hurry to get out. I'll swim right round the moat while I'm about it." It was a very much longer swim than he expected, and as he swam he noticed one or two things that struck him as rather odd. One was that he couldn't see his hands, and another was that he couldn't feel his feet. And he met some enormous fishes, like great cod or halibut they seemed, He had had no idea that there were freshwater fish of that size. They towered above him more like men o' war than fish, and he was rather glad to get past them. There were numbers of smaller fishes, some about his own size, he thought. They seemed to be enjoying themselves extremely, and he admired the clever quickness with which they darted out of the way of the great hulking fish. And then suddenly he ran into something hard and very solid, and a voice above him said crossly,
"Now then, who are you shoving off? Can't you keep your eyes open and keep your nose out of gentlemen's shirt fronts?"
"I beg your pardon," said Kenneth, trying to rub his nose and not being able to. "I didn't know people could talk under water," he added, very much astonished to find that talking under water was as easy to him as swimming there.
"Fish can talk under water, of course,"
said the voice.
"If they didn't, they'd never talk at all. They certainly can't talk out of it."
"But I'm not a fish," said Kenneth, and felt himself grin at the absurd idea.
"Yes, you are," said the voice. "Of course you're a fish."
And Kenneth, with a shiver of certainty, felt that the voice spoke the truth. He was a fish. He must have become a fish at the very moment when he fell into the water. That accounted for his not being able to see his hands or feel his feet. Because, of course, his hands were fins and his feet were a tail. "Who are you?" he asked the voice, and his own voice trembled.
"I'm the Dwyan Carp," said the voice. "You must be a very new fish indeed, or you'd know that. Come up and let's have a look at you."
Kenneth came up and found himself face to face with an enormous fish who had round staring eyes and a mouth that opened and shut continually. It opened square like a kit bag, and it shut with an extremely sour and severe expression like that of an offended rhinoceros.
"Yes," said
The Carp.
"you are a new fish. Who put you in?"
"I fell in," said Kenneth, "out of the boat. But I'm not a fish at all. Really I'm not. I'm a boy. But I don't suppose you'll believe me."
"Why shouldn't I believe you?"
asked the Carp, wagging a slow fin.
"Nobody tells untruths under water."
And if you come to think of it, no one ever does.
"Tell me your true story,"
said the Carp very lazily, and Kenneth told it.
"Ah, these humans,"
said the Carp when he had done.
"Always in such a hurry to think the worst of everybody."
He opened his mouth squarely and shut it contemptuously.
"You're jolly lucky, you are. Not one boy in a million turns into a fish, let me tell you."
"Do you mean that I've got to go on being a fish?" Kenneth asked.
"Of course you'll go on being a fish, as long as you stop in the water. You couldn't live here, you know, if you weren't."
"I might if I was an eel," said Kenneth, and thought himself very clever.
"Well, be an eel then,"
said the Carp, and swam away sneering and stately. Kenneth had to swim his hardest to catch up. "Then if I get out of the water, shall I be a boy again?" he asked, panting.
"Of course, silly,"
said the Carp.
"only you can't get out."
"Oh, can't I?" said Kenneth the fish, whisked his tail and swam off. He went straight back to the amethyst ring, picked it up in his mouth, and swam into the shallows at the edge of the moat. Then he tried to climb up the slanting mud and on to the grassy bank, but the grass hurt his fins horribly, and when he put his nose out of the water the air stifled him, and he was glad to slip back again,